This class is to introduce some of the themes in Hinduism that will come up over the next few weeks as we discuss this, the first of our religions of India that we'll be considering in this course. The term Hindu itself is originally a geographical rather than a religious term. It refers to people who live over here to the eastern side of the Indus River. It's what the Greeks called people who lived on the other side of the Indus River, the Indus. So this means that those people who were originally called the Indus people, it's really, it encompasses a very broad range of beliefs, right? It doesn't originally refer to one set of religion, but rather people who practice religion that way over there on the Indian subcontinent. The very first Hindus were immigrants from what is now Iran, some 3,500 years ago, who came over to India, bringing their own religion, which was rooted in a set of texts which were passed down by memory called the Vedas. The Vedic religion, the earliest form of Hindu religion, was basically a sacrificial religion which revolved around the ritual use of fire. Fire, which were maintained by the priests, the Brahmins of this religion, were used to make offerings of all sorts of things. Animal sacrifice was a part of this religion, as it was part of many religions of antiquity, but other things would be offered into a fire as well. Cooked food or vegetables and plants. And the main purpose of this was that in the context of a ritual fire offering, an invitation would be made to gods and goddesses to come down, partake of what is being offered into the fire, and to ask some favor in return. May there be more cattle for my herd. May a healthy son or daughter be born to me. The actual text that we're using this, the Vedas, these are the earliest Hindu text we have. There are four of them, the four Vedas, were memorized by Brahmin priests, people whose hereditary job it was. That is, their dad knew one of the four Vedas and would pass on this knowledge to their sons. These are the people who are in charge of chanting the Vedas when they are invited to do so by someone who would pay for them to chant the Veda that they knew in a public ceremony. These could be very elaborate sorts of things that could take many days to perform, to recite an entire Veda, to create the ritual fire and to make the offerings in it. This was the livelihood of the Brahmin caste, right? The highest social strata of early Hindu society, the people who were in charge of memorizing the Vedas. Beyond rituals that Brahmins were actually paid to perform, there were expectations that Brahmins would chant the Vedas as a part of their daily routine every morning and every night. And it was thought that the chanting of the Vedas was required to keep the wheels of the cosmos and the processes of nature turning in balance. So the recitation of the Vedas was responsible for making the rains come on time so that the crops could grow. It was even believed that every night when the sun sets behind the western horizon, that the sun shattered into 1,000 pieces, and that the chanting of the Vedas was required to reconstitute the sun, to put it back together as a unitary whole once again. And if we transport ourselves back to the social landscape of that time, we can imagine how it was that people imagine such things. What do you see if you look out there in the empty night after the sun goes down? You see the individual campfires, the open fires, the hearths that people have in their homes, hundreds or thousands of fires out there on the horizon. It might have looked as if when the sun sets at night, that the landscape is dotted with many, many pieces of the sun that disintegrated on impact. And that the sun had to be reconstituted, put back together so that it could rise again in the east the next morning. Newcomers to Hinduism are surprised to find that the Vedas are very worldly texts. They're worldly texts both in their content, the actual content of what the Vedas are saying. These are stories of divine drama. Gods getting married and getting divorced, gods getting in fights with each other, things that are familiar to us from Greek and Roman myths. They are worldly in their content, but the Vedas are also worldly in their application. They're very practical and utilitarian texts. You pay someone to chant the Vedas so that you can obtain some worldly or material benefits, right? That something good can happen to you, more cattle, more money, a healthy son and daughter can be born to you. Nowhere in the Vedas do we find anything about renouncing the world or ideals about nonviolence or running off in the woods to become a yogi. The Vedas really don't have anything to say about that. That's a later development in the Hindu tradition. In terms of cosmology, the Vedas have a few vague things to say about what happens to you after you die. They say that upon death, your soul force, your life breath is evaporated up into the sky where it goes and is stored in the moon, after which time it returns to earth in the form of rain and precipitation, is absorbed by plants, by grasses and trees, and is eaten by animals, and thus becomes once again the life force of living beings. So maybe something like the water cycle of evaporation and precipitation that we learn about in middle school. In terms of Vedic accounts of the origins of everything, the origins of the universe, Genesis, there is a passage that gives some account of this, though we'll see that it is somewhat vague. It's underdetermined. It leaves a lot of room for interpretation. We might compare it first with the biblical account of creation. So probably everyone has some basic familiarity with the story of Genesis in the Bible. God creates the world in 6 days and then he rests on the seventh. But why does God create the world according to the Christian tradition? What is his motivation? I think that it's important to keep in mind that the way that this is really explained is that God, who is omnibenevolent, who is all good, creates the world, and this is from the Catechism of the Roman Catholic Church. He creates the world in a plan of sheer goodness. He freely creates humankind to make us share in his own blessed life, right? God creates because he's all loving. He wants to create human beings who have the free will and the capacity to love him back. And the important thing about this is that creation in the Bible is explained in very human emotional terms. You know, why does God create? Because he's a loving God and he wants to share his own blessed life with his creation, right? So love, agape is the Greek word here. Love is the governing principle of the account of God's creation of the world and of humankind in the biblical tradition. We might take a look at the Nasabdiya Sukta, or the hymn to creation in the Rig Veda, which is the earliest of the Hindu Vedas, and compare it with the first sentence of the Bible. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. What similarities do we see? A couple. We have the formless void here, formless void in the Bible. And in the Rig Veda, all that existed then was void and formless. We have some water imagery. We have God's breath, the ruach of God, sweeping over the face of the waters. And of course, we know that God is going to separate the waters from dry land, right? In the Bible. We have in the Rig Veda this question: was there water of unfathomable depth? Question mark, maybe. So a couple of similarities, but also a couple of very obvious differences. In the Bible, God is apart from creation. God precedes creation, right? God is eternal. God is immaterial. He is all good, all knowing, and all powerful. And it is his agency that acts on the material world to create the universe that we know, of course, to create Adam and to breathe life into him. Whereas in the Rig Veda, we are not told that there is some mind or consciousness or agentive force preceding the act of creation. Everything that there is comes out of this moment of creation, whatever that is. All there is one thing, one lump of undifferentiated formlessness. Tad ekam in Sanskrit. It literally means that one. Eka is the number one. In the beginning, desire, kama, which really means sexual desire, descended on it. That was the primal seed. The word here in Sanskrit is ritas, which means reproductive seed, as you might find in an ovary or a testy. Creation, as is described in the Rig Veda, is couched in this very biological and indeed sexually reproductive imagery. Somehow the universe is aroused by itself, and if we'll pardon the image, impregnates itself. And this is the Big Bang moment. This is the moment of creation, according to the Rig Veda. Completely different concept than we find in the biblical case. We just have one lump of stuff, tad ekam, that one thing, out of which the differentiation of everything we know, mind and matter, all the various forms of the material world that make up our universe, issue from. One of the very interesting things about Hinduism is that the fact that the story of creation is so underdetermined means that later Hindu commentators interpreted what that one thing was at the beginning of time in very different ways. There were some, the Sankhya school or the atheist materialist school, who maintained that that one thing was just gross matter, atoms. Everything that makes up the world around us, including us, is just little tiny particles. Our consciousness, our internal dialogue is merely epiphenomenal to, or a byproduct of our material bodies. As we'll discuss more next week, contrasted with the materialist school is the idealist school. So that one thing is not matter, but rather mind, specifically the mind of Vishnu. Vishnu, who is God, who lies asleep on a serpent floating in space, and who is dreaming the reality which we all experience. So you and I, though the world around us is merely a projection of the dream of Vishnu. This is the cosmic illusion that what we think is reality and solid things is really merely the imagination of God, and we're all characters in that play. So we have the materialists, here the idealists. Everything is really just ideas or the mind of Vishnu. And in a few weeks, we'll talk about South Indian Shaivism, which has a theology that is somewhat familiar to Christianity. Here, that thing in the beginning is a creator God, an all-loving creator God, Shiva, who sets the material world in motion so that individual souls can go through this painful process of rebirth over many lifetimes, after which they realize their true divine nature as being like Shiva, and go on to live in a state of heavenly bliss with God, Shiva, the creator, after that point. So this is something akin to the Christian theological concept of things, whereby here God, who is eternal, like the God of the Bible, who has the best interests of living beings at heart, creates the world that sets the matter in motion, so that our individual souls can be implanted in physical bodies, might one day realize our inner divinity. So obviously not identical with Christianity, but some similarities to it. So that's Shaivism. Hindus who revere Shiva as the supreme God, the eternal God, the creator God. There are many gods and goddesses named in the Vedas. There's a whole bunch of them, but at no point do the Vedas say that one god or goddess is the supreme or the ultimate or the creator god. Hindus who make such assertions are going to come later in the tradition, famously in the sects that develop around three gods, sometimes referred to as the Hindu Trinity, God Brahma on the left, God Vishnu in the middle, and God Shiva on the right. We'll spend next week talking about Vaishnavism, or Hindus who revere Vishnu as the supreme god, and this makes up the majority of Hindus in the world today, about 70%. Beyond the gods of the Hindu Trinity, there are many, many gods and goddesses named in Hindu sacred texts. After the Vedas, there are many hundreds of sacred texts. Sometimes people will give the number saying that there are 4,320,000 gods and goddesses in Hinduism. I'm not sure exactly how you calculate that number or whether you could get all Hindus to agree on it. But certainly there are lots of gods, and it's not as if all Hindus worship all of those gods. There are some Hindus who might worship only one god or just a few gods, right? Should we conclude then that Hinduism is a polytheistic religion? Certainly intuitively, it would seem like it, right? There's a lot of gods. Different Hindus worship different gods, so they're polytheistic. They have many gods. In getting a handle on this question, however, I would ask us to pause for a moment to consider what in classical Hindu theology really represents the central mystery of Hindu thought, this principle that calls into question the proposition that Hinduism is really polytheistic, or at least complicates the idea that Hinduism is necessarily polytheistic. So if we think about the central mystery of Christianity, the doctrine of the Trinity, well, what does it mean? It means that the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit are three distinct things, distinct beings, but which share in the same substance. That the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit somehow are identical with God or are a part of God, but which are not identical with one another. It is, of course, a difficult concept to get our minds around, but the Bible does present us with this problem, right? When Jesus is there dying on the cross and his last words are, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, my God, why have you forsaken me? Is he talking to himself? What's going on there? Jesus, he says in the Gospel of John, the Father and I are one. This is, part of how the doctrine of the Trinity comes to evolve. Jesus is, in some sense, identical in substance with God, and yet clearly he is not the same being as God the Father, right? This is a preoccupation of Christian theologians and has been for the better part of the last 2,000 years. Similarly, the central theological mystery of Hinduism is this refrain that we find in the Upanishads, which are the big set of philosophical texts that come after the Vedas. Three words in Sanskrit, tat, tvam, asi, that you are. Thou art that, you are that. And what does this mean? The tvam, the you here, refers to the personal soul, the individual soul, the Atman, the immortal component of not just every human being, but every sentient being, every being that has consciousness, which is in some sense identical with that tat, which is Brahman, often translated as the oversoul, the Godhead, or the mind of God. The individual soul, the Atman, and the soul in you and I, in every living being, is somehow identical with, shares in substance with, partakes in the mind of God. What does it mean? Well, it is, again, a mystery, and Hindu theologians are going to be at pains to explain it in different ways. It is a pretty startling and profound proposition, though, when you think about it. That means that every living being is, in some sense, well, themselves divine. It is the origin of the Sanskrit greeting namaste, saying hello to someone. Namas, it literally means prostrating yourself or bowing down, doing worship to you, worshiping the divinity in the person whom you are greeting. It is the Tattvam Asi underwrites the slogan of a recent tourism campaign by the Indian government, Atithi Devo Bhava. The guest is God. If you come to India and you go and you visit the Taj Mahal, then you yourself will be treated like a god. Why? Well, because you are one. Divinity resides within you. Your Atman is a mirror of the mind of God. Hinduism is in this way what we might call a big tent religion. It has a lot of room for interpretation. It has a lot of room to contain various concepts of spirituality within it. And Hinduism tends to be very accepting of other forms of religion and other concepts of divinity. Gandhi would famously say that Ishvara Allah Tere Nama, or that Ishvara, or the God of Hindus, the Lord, is the same name as Allah, the God of the Quran. That is, the God that Hindus worship is the same God that Muslims worship. You can even find Hindus who will accept that Jesus Christ was an incarnation of God. Jesus Christ was an avatar, an avatara of the divine, right? So what does that mean, though? Does that mean that we can say that Hindus are Christians or that Hindus are Muslims? What are some of the problems with saying that? If we were in class, we would have a discussion right now about the readings that I assign, including Stephen Prothero's Why the Dalai Lama is Wrong. Please just go ahead and read it right now for yourself. I don't have to go over it. I will just conclude by saying that this is a really hard class to teach. One reason is that these traditions, Hinduism, Jainism, Buddhism, are very wide-ranging. They have many, many different texts, many, many different sects and schools, and it's my job to distill these teachings down into something that's digestible and comprehensible for everybody, which is hard. But the second reason this course is hard is that I think that there is a temptation to surrender to a kind of feel-good universalism or pluralism, as Stephen Prothero calls it, or omnism was the term that was in the other reading for today. The idea that at the end of the day, despite their outward differences, all religions really are saying the same thing. All religions have the same message, and maybe even all religions worship the same God, right? This is universalism, universal truth in all religions. And while I won't a priori deny that there well might be universal and essential teachings between religions, if we surrender to that easy claim that at the end of the day, all religions are saying the same things, then we run the risk of ignoring what is unique and what is distinct about each of these different traditions. And we run the risk of even perhaps offending those who are concerned to maintain these differences, right? That is, people who want to say, this is what is distinct about my religious tradition, and we can't be too eager to make surface level comparisons to try to say that all religions are saying the same thing. So that is my cautionary note for this second introductory session, and I'll look forward to seeing you all next week.